my great honour and delight to be introducing today Samuel Ross, who I'm sure you've all heard of. He's an artist and designer. He started his career in product design, working with a number of commercial brands before he began working with Virgil Abloh as an intern. He then went on to found his own brand, A Cold Wall, in 2014, which is a luxury menswear fashion label, sort of sitting between high-end fashion and streetwear. And he's worked across many disciplines in his career, including graphic design and experimental film and fine art and sculpture. And he recently also founded the industrial design studio SRA. So I could talk at length about the various things that Samuel has achieved, but I will begin the interview. Thank you so much, Samuel, for being here with us, and also we're all very excited to have you. I just want to start by asking you about your multidisciplinary approach to your practice. So you have, as I mentioned, worked in a number of disciplines, including graphic design and product design and fashion. And I was wondering how these different forms of art interact, and how do you think that working in one form has influenced your work in fashion, for example, and vice versa?
Firstly, thank you for having me here, and it's much appreciated for your time on a Monday, or it feels like a Monday. It's a joy to be here and within the studio, being able to speak in these type of forums of thought, which are, relatively expressive and free in their nature surrounding the arts, is always a joy. Relating to two things. One, I don't have my clicker, and we're going to need that. So to answer your first question, I guess, like, this notion of how a language comes about, and this ability to kind of mediate and transpose different fields, it feels at its heart really like a liberty. The freedom that one has to express themselves across the medium of charcoal or graphite or 3DM files or rendering software or draftsmanship. I've never necessarily seen that there needs to be like a distinct line between each of those disciplines, whether it's fashion or fine art, sculpture, furniture design, or industrial design. Because fundamentally, none of these entities in reality, in the commercial world, in practical application, live on their own. They all congeal with these other disciplines. So as you would go about thinking about the optimal height of a chair or a stool or a table, you also consider the temperature and the depth of texture and the sourcing of the material, and then the semantics may be associated with all of those elements coming together. So there isn't necessarily one specific way of looking at each discipline. It's more so this oscillation of expression across different fields, which kind of ends up in the prospect of a multidisciplinary practice. There was never necessarily an intent to be a multidisciplinary. It was always just this inquiry into creating and manifesting some type of practical idea, which led to multiple fields being of interest.
Sure. I think it's fascinating how you don't see your practice as fitting a specific box or being defined in a specific way. So you've often referred to your work as a craft, which to me suggests this notion of being artisanal and being potentially handmade and more individualized than the sort of industry-made materials which we see so often. So how would you define your work, or not define maybe, how do you see your work in relation to this concept of craft? And what is the significance of craft to you? And when answering, could you talk also about your process in making specific things? For example, your paintings or sculptures, how do you approach that process of creation?
Completely. So I think there's this relationship to the idea of the maker's hand and the impetus of what the soul or spirit can bear through craft and through the physicality of making, which is endless and eternal, right? It's something that we've kind of developed over millennia across all cultures, and there's something which is anonymous from a particular ilk or race, but really speaks to the human spirit when it comes to the notion of craft. Probably because of earlier background in commercial and graphic and visual communication in my studies, you're kind of taught to coerce and to entice through various thematics, and the notion of craft still feels like an uncategorized plot of land that one can almost explore freely, and even free of sometimes the expectations of what it is to operate within the arts. There's still an expectation of distance from touch or distance from surface and texture, which comes about within the remit of a gallery. Craft seems to be this intimate play with material and discovery and continuous failure and breakthrough that I tend to enjoy. And I guess portions of that behaviour have evoked themselves through the work. I mean, even if you look at Birth at Dawn, which is on screen now, it's this process of found materials such as OSB and refined woods, which are then decimated and shredded, and through iterations and experiments with the studio team, some who are here, and within my own studio space outside of the city, we're finding new ways to almost alchemize what already exists. And there's a whole strata of thought surrounding found object and what it means for our generation to deem what found object truly is, when there's a surplus of industrial materials which have kind of formed modernity. So part of that is reappropriating found object, reappropriating synthetic material, and reintroducing them back into the remit of the maker's hand and the notion of craft. And there's clearly this vernacular that we have been working on developing, which kind of sits between a postmodern modernist view or allegory of what society could be, and then the truth often ingrained into these materials that we select. The notion of, for example, taking ply and OSB and soaking it within concrete and then firing the material is really about awakening. It's partly spiritual and partly down to the composition of how materials and polymers work. So on one side, you look at how you can integrate these materials by taking them down to a very small module, like a hair grain of wood, contrasted with turmeric or honey or charcoal or ash and volcanic debris and paint and steel, and you're bringing them into one milieu almost to produce a new material but still be able to identify their source. And the other element is to awaken materials. So the idea of firing and birth through fire, and by that I mean, if we think about found wood, not even found wood, if we think about synthetic wood, and when you heat it, of course, the polymers then react to the heat, which unveils a new surface, a new residue, a new texture, which also speaks to the essence of the material and the fact that it isn't completely organic, which is a reflection of the times that we're in. So all of these thoughts kind of go into found wood. Not even found wood, if we think about synthetic wood, and when you heat it, of course, the polymers then react to the heat, which unveils a new surface, a new residue, a new texture, which also speaks to the essence of the material and the fact that it isn't completely organic, which is a reflection of the times that we're in. So all of these thoughts kind of go into how we kind of take this synthetic and bring it closer to craft.
Sure. I mean, it almost sounds scientific in a way, the way you describe bringing materials down to their essence and working with that. And so what is a really exciting combination of materials that you've worked with, or the non-standard materials that you've worked with?
I find them all exciting, and probably more exciting than they are, but our team were deeply enjoying almost the impetus of what it is to include milk and honey, and these almost Abrahamic biblical terms or materials that we have read about for millennia, and integrating them into rapport with contemporary or quote unquote modern de facto materials such as concrete, such as scrap steel, and finding a way to bring them together. So on the front burnished corner here, you can actually see that we have kind of coated the concrete with milk and honey, and then we fired that to kind of deteriorate the surface of the concrete slightly, but also to build some type of vernacular and rapport with the treatment of the wood flecks that you can see throughout. And towards the back is clearly a piece of Nero granite, which has this beautiful hand-treated patina of like a red plastisol paint. So there's this notion of materials coming together but still developing some type of formality in terms of colour, in terms of depth, in terms of treatment across the board. Even here, to answer your question directly, within this painting is on show at the moment alongside a Frank Bowling piece and Herman Anderson piece in Claridge's Art Space as part of Freeze Art Week this week. And this contains charcoal, which is of interest to me, but also volcanic ash from the 1971 eruption of La Soufrière in St. Vincent. And this really comes down to the notion of how to pull one's self, one's history, one's genealogy, one's bloodline into the practice of painting, into the practice of abstraction, and trying to find some place for newness whilst considering the existing British Caribbean canon. So I'm looking to find a way to contribute to particular canons within British art, as well as finding ways to expand. It's more of an expansion and contribution and probably less of a disruption, though some of the techniques may be deemed disruptive, but there is no preparing of like a traditional canvas in this. This is dark canvas which is then soaked, in iodine and turmeric, and pouring in industrial paints which have been purchased within the local remit of where I paint, which in itself is a study of who gets to paint and why they get to paint and the access to material and resources. But all of that doesn't really matter when it comes into the process. When you're in the studio for 8 hours, 10 hours, and you're heaving canvas around, and you have your sketchbooks and you have your notes, you might have all of these esoteric psychedelic thoughts, but at the end of the day, what comes about is much more of a revelation through the process.
Well, that's really fascinating, and it's interesting that you find a way to make the physical artwork, not just by the way it looks, convey a certain message, but also in the way that it's made, using the physical materials themselves contain meaning. So I was wondering how you see, or I know you touched on it there, but how do you see your work in a sort of art historical framework? Because a lot of your work, as I understand, takes inspiration from minimalism and brutalism. So how do you see your work in relation to that? And I mean, you said you don't see it as disruptive, but how do you see it as how do you see it as building upon it?
Yeah, he gave a good quote about this, like and it's a bit of a joke and a satire, but it's still relevant to such a question, and it is, you kind of pick up the first star of the book that you pick up at the first term of semester, and that's what kind of leaves an imprint or leaves some type of etching on you. There's definitely this relationship to, I guess, two architectural movements in particular we all know well, modernism and brutalism for the most part. And I think that, my formative years as of where I was raised in primarily a working class area, and having this rapport between the East Midlands and between South West London, Brixton, my place of birth, this rapport and continuous exposure to particular materials and particular ways in which those materials are formatted, which of course came off the back of a purported view that really brutalist and could form some type of modernist utopia that one could live in, and that would kind of bring the classes together, and possibly seeing what was felt at the time as being a failure of that to happen has seeped into my language and way of seeing, you could say. So almost the imprint in how I register shape and form is deeply tied to those formative years spent between the city, spent between growing up within the East Midlands in a relatively, not extremely impoverished area, but a relatively impoverished area, but still having this striking expression live within the immediate household. And those early years have fundamentally formed how I view shape and form, and also studying a background in graphic and product design is so clear when you start to see the asymmetry and the geometry coming into play, and these simple linear forms and how they all kind of coerce and congeal. There's a layer of lived experience, and then there's a layer of academia, which has kind of birthed this visual style. it's clear who I was reading about in school, why they were of interest. If you think about, the lineage of British sculptors, whether it's Hepworth or Whitread or Carrow or Moore, you can see annexes of their sprinklings in this work, because I do see myself first as a British artist. For any particular demographic or diaspora, it's first that lived experience of what it means to be British and to communicate through such a lens.
Absolutely, that's really interesting. You mentioned just at the beginning a quote from Virgil Abloh. So for those of you who don't know, Virgil Abloh was an absolutely iconic figure in the world of fashion. He founded the label OffWhite and Pirate Vision, and Samuel worked with him at the beginning of his career, and you had quite a close working relationship, which is incredible. And I'm really interested to hear something that has stuck with you from your work with Virgil, that has influenced the way that you approach your craft, or that you thought was really amazing about the way Virgil approached his.
Sure, yeah. I think it's really. I've got some images of V and I in here as well. I will pull those up, and I think this example, Fire Open Stone is probably a good reference to the type of vernacular that Virgil and I were quite keen to establish cross-category. It's this relationship fundamentally between typography and industrial process and material, and Joseph Alber's colour theory references coming into play, all forming a vernacular which is hypervisual. This is the title that we would often give it. What I learned from V and what we look to develop outside of like a language which involved multiple objects. I mean, you can see this, and you can still see how this vernacular would relate to, of course, some of Virgil's work, because it was a particular way of seeing shape, form, and typography and colour that we were quite keen to establish, which then, of course, scaled and created a whole entirely new category in terms of how what we would deem to be Gen Z millennials engage with fashion and identity. But our main focus really was off the back of fundamentally not being able to accrue placements or partnerships with studios such as Sagmeister and Ross and Pentagram. We fundamentally were developing a new canon of thought and a new canon of design thinking which could be applied across the arts, and the application that figures like Virgil or Tremaine or fundamentally all of us were working for Ye as well, the founder of Donda. We all saw that there could be a new way in which communication could become more relevant, and we wanted to go about building these small think tanks and studios to really purport newness and ideas to come about, and the flexibility and fluidity which then fundamentally became PLCs or limited companies which scaled off of this impetus was really only in place because there was no form of barrier, because there was no traditional acceptance to a field which gives you this ability to move as quickly as you wish to or as slowly as you wish to, or to be as abstract as one feels they need to frack and generate new ideas. When you're kind of on your own track, there isn't a waiting list or a pecking order that one needs to follow. You simply aggregate at your own pace.
Well, I think it's really interesting to hear how fruitful and how many new ideas could spring from that collaboration you had with Virgil. To go to a sort of different topic now, so with the Cold War, which is the brand that you founded, you've done a lot of different work with a number of other brands, including Apple. You've collaborated with Timberland and Converse, and you have this legacy collaboration with Nike, which has lasted 7 years, I believe.
Yes.
7 years. So Cold War has done several models of different Nike shoes over the years, and your most recent one is a reinvention of the 98s. And I think this shoe is, I think it's such a cool shoe. I mean, it comes in the black, white, and blue colours, and I think the blue is this extraordinary shade of blue, and you had an exhibition at Dover Street Market recently, which also was in that shade of blue, which again was amazing. So what were your ideas going into this specific collaboration on the 98 shoe? Why the choice of this particular model, and what were you trying to convey through your reinvention of the model?
Sure. I think the easiest way to talk about 98 is actually to talk about the dynamic with Nike, and the depth of that partnership, as you were saying, stems back to around 7.5 years, which started as a small form of informal consultancy and slowly moved into forming a perspective on products which already existed within the remit of their portfolio. And the whole view I've always had with Nike is that the product that they put forward is already perfect for the most part. It's already well recognized. It was more so about slowing down the viewer's experience and being able to take in what's happening across the material placements and to rediscover interests and cadences from, I guess, slightly more from also from an industrial design perspective, which maybe weren't being anchored or extrapolated, because we're in the age of viewing these products for the most part on a 4x5 screen. So to achieve a language coming about, it was actually about taking elements away. It was about stripping these products for the most part of secondary layers of branding, being quite discreet and aggressive with placements of typography. It's adding translucency and lucidity to the product itself. It's integrating in subtle contrasts which you can not just simply enjoy, but have some type of intrigue in relation to touch. The notion of texture coming into play, temperature coming into play, exploring the brevity of different like plastic and leather, well, in particular plastic polymers, and what that can offer in terms of pliability, which again is a moment of discovery for the user or for the viewer. And when we are using slightly more organic materials, whether it be a nappa leather or a veg tan leather, ensuring that there is a proximity of pushing beyond the typical quota of material quality you would expect for a widely distributed consumer product. So really making sure that spirit of craft then returns into the portfolio of Nike products. And that's really been our main annex against other contemporaries and competitors. It's been slowing down the remit, but also having a pendulum swing. So for example, we talk about the Vomeros that we produce, which have the large architectural form, sealed onto the back of the footbed, so you can't actually remove the product. It was forcing a conversation around sculpture at a very granular level in the public forum through the lens of fashion, which then became a catalyst for wider conversations about sculpture, public art, who gets to experience it, and why, and what the right medium of expressing such ideas is now when you're thinking about reaching a wide array of people. If you think about the Air Force One High, which was never supposed to release commercially, it was a personal project which then was well received. It was about taking the Air Force, which is already perfect, and simple gestures just to reveal the beauty of the shoe and the idea of the unfinished human hand still being present within a commercial cycle. Taking off the Nike swoosh, leaving the perforations in place, the idea of the maker being present, reversing the leather skins so you're not having to deviate from the margins which are already fixed on the commercial product. A lot of this is to do with, successful product isn't just expressive product. It's not just the ego of like a designer or an artist, getting thrills out of making something. It's also nailing the marginality of play and ensuring that the corporate entity finds success through expression as well as the designer.
Sure. Within that, you touched upon the sort of different textures involved in the works that you do, and I think this makes me think about the sensory element that's often present in the exhibitions that you do. So earlier this year, you had an exhibition at White Cube where you had incense burning, like you do now. And I think this is a good moment to ask you about why the significance of the different sensory elements to a work of art and how it makes you as the viewer become more, I suppose, connected to the work, and it involves you in experience rather than just being a sort of viewer and work relationship, but you become more part of it.
Yes.
As I understand. So yeah, tell us about the significance of the senses to your work.
Yeah, scent just feels less transactional in its way of inhibiting one space, or to ushering in a deeper sense of resonance or connection to object. And it's the ability to kind of cleanse a remit, an area, a forum. Of course, we know scent's always been used as the commencing of ritual, or to signify the ending of a particular ritual, and bringing that into contemporary culture, into wider experiences and public forums has just been this habit which has started as like a personal matter of being able to shift sense and typically temperature as well. Those two variables, of course sound, which is the given, but scent and temperature are the two variables which we tend to take quite some care over, whether it's on the remit of a runway show, where we'll drop the temperature down to 14 or 15 degrees to kind of bring out a frigidity or fraughtness or a tension in the body, which then affects, of course, how one views the work. When you kind of syncopate that with the movement of the models and the movement of material and architecture on the body, there's always this diagonal line, or this lateral way of experiencing environment and sense that we try to elicit. Sometimes it's to antagonize, sometimes it's to quell or to sedate, or to bring some type of lucidity to space. And other times it's also, again, to usher in the beginning or the commencement. And the particular scent I typically use is hand rolling Calcutta. If I can't get it, I'll just use Nag Champa, which is deeply connected to core memories that I have of the family home and these other emotional remits. But scent always to bring forward a deeper connection to space and to visual literacy is exactly that's at the core of that.
That's really interesting. I mean, I was also going to ask you about so you founded the Black British Artists Grants Programme in 2020, which gives scholarships to emerging talent in the Black artistic community. So this makes me think that you're very passionate about the development of new talent. So leading from this, what is your vision for the future of fashion and graphic design and product design, and what do you hope to see in those areas? What do you predict? What do you hope to see? And what are your thoughts on the future of fashion and design?
I think that there's two. I mean, the main thought I consider a lot surrounding the grants program and the advisory board that we kind of built. Was that one can't just see an issue and a problem and just complain and mope and tweet and talk about it verbosely and amongst friends, and not actually apply any type of like conducive testing or like trialing of a program or trialing of some new mechanism which could come about. So the whole prospect of the grants program was initially a response to two macroeconomic issues. Well, actually, one is a macro and one is more of a cultural issue. First was, of course, George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and the reawakening of civil rights relations. The second moment, of course, was the macroeconomic disparity brought forward from COVID. And we had these two overlays simultaneously kind of meet one another. And without a doubt, we all felt that there was some type of like sharp tension, which wasn't necessarily on our side about advocacy and ushering in a perspective on civil rights, because I have very specific critiques on the success of that over the recent 10 to 15 years. What this did offer was a practical implication of grassroots independent funding that we could control and solicit and apportion accordingly. And the whole prospect here was to ensure that the giving or annexing of capital and grants would happen to ensure new artistic movements within the British canon of arts continue to exist. You know, and by that I mean there's no point in having one artist or two artists do well across 10 or 20 or 15 year period. It means nothing. It doesn't exist within, you know, the vacuum of time. We need there to be movements. We need there to be conversation. We need people to have publishing. We need, you know, talks, performances, exhibitions, dinners, meals, exchanging of thoughts. All of this needs to occur, and you just need to look at the data. It's not even really an opinion, just based on, like, you know, populace counts, in particular the British Caribbean demographic that I'm part of, is such a small percentile within the British, you know, headcount, that it needs support. It needs, more so than support, it's also the visibility of that demographic communicating and being pushed forward into public forum. So it wasn't just about giving capital and grants, it was also about making sure the right level of accreditation occurred. And to build some status or form of accreditation, we put forward a advisory board. So we pretty much pitched and harpooned and developed an advisory board which is formed of the Prince's Trust, the V&A, the RCA, we have the British Fashion Council, we have Westminster University in there, we have good relations with the AA and CSM, who are also kind of part of that wider demographic and advisory group. And it's really about making sure that these incredible talents, because it's not necessarily a charity, it's simply just accrediting great talents, are also accredited by these, you know, really important academic bodies and institutions. And we've seen individuals such as, you know, Reed Dillon, who's a brilliant artist, go on to have solo shows at Tate Britain, or if I Marcus, an artist, go on to win the Hugo Design Prize, and Matt Collins represent the country in the most recent Venice Architectural Biennale. These are individuals who all kind of come through the program, you can say, but also it's about finding and building community and movements in this country within the arts.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's very important work that is being done, and I think it's really interesting how you view fashion and design as more than just something important for aesthetic reasons, but it is something which is able to be used for social change. So I think with fashion especially, I mean, what do you think about the role of fashion in expressing the lived experience of people in Britain, of the working class community, which comes into your work a lot. So, what do you consider the role of fashion as a form for social change and as an expression of that lived experience?
So two things. I'm going to go through like 70 slides super quick to get to the fashion stuff. So just try to like shake your heads and like absorb as much as physically possible in that intro. It's like a visual syncopation. What is seance at the moment? Okay, let's so I spent so much time making sure these 100 slides, which we'll never have time to completely go through, kind of phase into this lapse of, you know, lucid materials in paint and sculpture into physical forms of materials, which kind of show how the thinking between fashion and sculpture and architecture and product actually is one channel and one silo of thought. And this page is probably a good summarizing of that. We don't necessarily think of fashion in a separate canon to these other mediums, because they all fundamentally lean upon upon one another's pillars to exist. And I kind of see our particular perspective in fashion having, you know, developed some type of stride with a Cold War, with this more industrious and architectural format of fashion, has come about because there wasn't really a presentation of that before on the runway. Maybe in contemporary and in premium price points, such as, like, you know, Stone Island, Valence, Chester Perry, the canon of Massimo Osti, of course, his work prior in industrial and in graphic design, which is actually the same studious background, and Jun Takahashi as well with Undercover. these are fundamentally industrial and graphic designers who move into menswear, which is a similar pathway. So there have been contemporaries to a Cold War and to SRA in fashion over the past 30 to 40 years, but I guess for our generation, Cold War kind of takes up part of that stride and that baton. And the way that we've kind of gone about ensuring that a Cold War doesn't necessarily fit within the traditional remit of fashion with a capital F, or what we believe it to be, is by trying to find cavities and voids which have not been communicated prior to then build a relationship to the body within fashion. And it sounds quite verbose, but it's fundamentally what you can see on the top right-hand side is a terminal for housing the body, which is formed of steel, which is a simple prototype. And beneath that you can see a seating unit for Signal 1 that was also produced. And again, they sit in different sides of the practice, but they both fundamentally house the body. Public sculpture, if we think about Moore or Caro or Hepworth or any of that canon, or if you think about, again, Noguchi as a good reference here, it all houses the body. It's the exact same job as fashion. Chair houses the body now, the chair takes the weight. It makes you weightless. There's a relationship to a soft fibre that we must engage with, that you're all engaging with now. There's no difference to that, it's just the density of the material. And we're quite aware of that. So here are some thoughts which were quickly scattered down when it comes to considering fashion within within the studios. And it's, again, architecture of the body. Our inception has always been about uniform. It's never really been about the idea of peacocking or displaying a particular signal of wealth. It's always been about this connotation of storytelling and being able to express some type of interior experience. Function as purpose. Function is purpose, even. It's quite clear. And the unseen and the voids of society to not be seen, and how that can convey itself in the remit of fashion is one of the inception points here. Of course, socio-political voids and cultural dissonance is quite clear. In 2014, when a Cold War was founded, I was dumbfounded by the fact that one could travel across the country and you could traverse council estates and working class areas and abandoned mining towns or cotton towns and tobacco hubs, really imperial hubs of the country. And you see this strong industrious language through architecture, through material, through red brick and through plaster and stone and breeze blocks and all these type of materials which weren't necessarily being reflected in the relationship we have to fashion and what was shown. So this was about taking all of that, you could say, jar of reality and burrowing it into material which could be worn to convey another side of Britain that we all know but often choose not to see or isn't necessarily celebrated. Development of that practically is taking the character of forgotten British architecture, primarily across the 20th century, and finding a way to make it pliable through material, but still ensuring that it's easy enough for people to understand what the reference at hand is. At tying within the remit of traditional fashion, there's often a delicacy of, there might be a single pleat or fold or dart, and or some type of bonding or fusing which is enough. One pleat is supposed to summarize a millennia of industrial trade. It's like, it doesn't work that way. We need more. And I guess the background in industrial graphic and visual communication really came into play to help report that. So the way that we treat materials, I don't even say fabrics, I say materials, they're treated as though they are industrial materials, which unlocked a freedom into creating shape and into creating form. And I'm just thinking, are there any other key points on there under development? So I should probably talk about the applied dissertation under development. And the reality is that a Cold War first came about in my graduating dissertation in graphic design and contemporary illustration, where the whole prospect of that think piece was the given freedom that menswear and suiting and tailoring between the 1960s and 1970s offered African Americans. the pliability it had within the civil rights movement. You think of the attire of Baldwin or Malcolm X or Fred Hampton or any of the names of that canon, or Thomas Sanko or Lulamba. All of these names, whether it be West African leaders or whether it's African American leaders of that period, there was a particular vernacular when it came to attire. And I was completely fixed on the autonomy of traditional British suiting and American suiting, being able to alleviate the conversation of race and for human to see human within contemporary society. So that was the crux of this dissertation that I wrote off the back of a graphic design major, funnily enough, which then became the foundation for a Cold War. But it was the inverse. It was less about suiting and tailoring. We do some of that, but it was more so about what does suiting mean for the now and the next generation, the generation which sits underneath the age of 35. And that fundamentally is utilitarian garments. It is the tracksuit, it is leisurely wear, it is athleisure. And I wanted to apply that type of context to those categories of products. The other note I will talk about before we go into all the lovely images and the cooling and stuff. Collaboration and IP gain. The Nike relationship is so fruitful because there's a fair transaction. It's a coalition. It's a great one. We give you great ideas, new ideas. You give us access to macro manufacturing and to new technology. And that type of syncopation is fundamentally how SMEs and small entities can find their feet, find their legs, and scale. That's fundamentally, I guess, how some of the team here and how Yi, my business partner, would attest in terms of how young artists can survive and thrive is through collaboration, and is through that fair trade of IP. Feeding the beast, feeding the machine, and being able to take enough from them fairly to grow your practice. This is no correlation to what I said, but it's relevant to the survey, which I felt important to include. I was like, do I include these images? Like, yes, we do. And this probably talks. This is a good attesting to the depth of the friendship and mentorship and partnership of brotherhood. This image on the left-hand side was from the second women's OffWhite Collection. And it was shot in Paris, just on someone's iPhone quickly, and we were kind of just prepping for one of the lookbooks, and this was actually, we were just tweaking. It was Christina Centenero who was actually leading on the majority of the styling for this particular shoot, but it kind of speaks to the intimacy of the founder's hand in every single aperture of that mountain process which comes about. And I believe 6 years onwards, this is Virgil and I, both collecting awards at the British Fashion Awards ceremony in maybe 2019, I believe, and this occurred for around 3 years, where year on year we would just keep picking up the BFA awards, and it kind of just speaks to this spirit of not just mentorship, but finding older peers and sparring partners. I was going to put a few others on this page, but you could add, Jerry Lorenzo onto this page, Tremaine Amori, Benji B onto this page, Ye for sake of conversation as well, who kind of, pioneered this canon of fundamentally, the African diaspora in the remit of design and in fashion from like a menswear perspective. These are also sparring partners to a degree, and each of these entities tied to these individuals have gone on to scale. So there's not just this creative almost gratification there is also a commercial impetus at the crux of how creativity is used, and that is core, that is really design thinking. And underneath all of that thinking, you still just need to have emotion come into play to connect with people. This is a still from our second Nike collaboration for the Vomero, which was a zine we produced with System Magazine. Again, we shot this in East London on Docklands, and we just wanted to create something which felt quite emotional and pull emotion without having to say too much, but show what it's felt. One of our early runway looks 2016, I believe, so just before we started doing runway, but we used this as a series of studies just to kind of play with material and weight and the idea of elation and control and volume and air kind of taking up form and shape to kind of disform the body, to create some type of freedom and spirit. This is just taken after like a series of small jumps. You can still see that tension and the impact and lift of the material paired with the Air Force, which felt like a nice relationship to language and the connotation of sport and lift associated with a basketball sneaker. The right hand side is actually more interesting than the left. We'll see the left, which is the diving mirror with the architectural form. And the discussion we had in Portland a number of times was, they really pushed for this unit to be removable. And for me, that would have just killed the entire approach of choice. Art, you can interpret art, but it doesn't give you a choice in how you engage with it. It presents itself and you often meet it. It solicits itself. And you enter conversation or seance with art. And this is, of course, design. So it's that tension point of design is service. It's serving the user, but trying to establish some notion of tension between, fine art, the role of art in society, and then the role of design and service in society. And this became quite a contested piece of design at the time, which went on to build cult status because you couldn't remove the back. And on one side, you had individuals who were literally buying the shoe and soaring this object off the shoe, which is fine because it goes into public forum and it's within their remit in terms of how they engage with material and form and their level of comfort. On the other end, you had the purists, right? So tourists are soaring it off, and the purists are keeping it, understanding this is an advent breakthrough, which fundamentally will lead to a new form of footwear and form coming into the trend cycle, which is fundamentally the role of also the artist and the designer is to kind of see the future, whether they be commercial or non-commercial. On the right hand side, it's just like a beautiful image of a fitting in our East London studio in 2016 before our breakthrough runway show. And again, these are Proto Pants, which kind of continue this study of removing weight from the body but still retaining form. Very, very tried and crude early studies into hand dyeing Air Forces and producing taking what's already produced and finding a new way to interpret it, and also just having fun and exploring within the studio. All of this process is an addiction to just generating and creating and having some type of release through that. Again, this is the shoe, of course, with the heel on the back undyed, the Vomero, and more prototypes of the Nike shoes which have debuted on the runway. And as you can see, this relationship to craft is quite clear. Like the way in which these assets come forth in these images, the way in which they're created doesn't necessarily differ from the work that I do with the physicality associated to some of the concrete furniture pieces and sculptural pieces. It's all kind of one silo or talent of form. There isn't necessarily a particular signature, but there's a passage. And it's fundamentally taking these different disciplines and almost dropping them into that vacuum or that tunnel of air and seeing how they fare when they come out on the other side. As Cobble started to mature, you can kind of see here, this is the purest vision of a very small team. And as we start to mature and grow, as we're still small, but when we're hitting revenues of 8 to 10 million at this point in year 4, we start to think about scalability. We start to think about, again, that fair sense of trade between public groups. At this point, this is Converse. It's not even Nike. We're focusing on Nike Group. How do we work with the group, and how do we deliver a uniform that one knows, a uniform of modernity, which is easy. This is the first series of images from our first pre-collection. These are a few conceptual images which haven't actually been seen before. They were part of a campaign for 2018. There's still this obsession with body dysphoria, almost like disforming the body and like finding ways to not necessarily magnify, but to talk about the absurdities of a post-colonial existence through skewing imagery, through these acidic, almost colours which carry such a synthetic richness, but within the richness and the absurdity of this being a true tone of neon, there's always this distance in there, this forced optimism which comes from such a saturation of colour. And looking at how skeuomorphic images and abstraction and richness can come into play to maybe not explain but express some of those matters. And I guess a lot of this with a Cold Wall has always been about finding a way to take these writings and these notes and place them into a feeling. It's more about the feeling than it is the explanation. The dissertations are for myself and the team, and it's for the literature and a lot of the writing that we partake in separate to what we sell and what we report as an image. But when it comes down to speaking to a community and awakening something in the spirit, it has to be felt. And these images aim to do that. They aim to pull an emotion, aim to, think about the first time you all saw a Henry Moore piece. It was who, what, when, why, where, how. We want to be able to pull that through fashion, and that is the beauty of fashion, that it is that macro canon, that it is so visual, that it is so immediate. And these are practical elements that come back down to earth outside of all that stuff. It's the practical implication of how the work is created. And I don't necessarily work just on body with twiling. My background is in draftsmanship. It's pen, it's paper, it's charcoal, it's ink. It's litho, it's print, it's sketching, it's notes, and then it's going into twiling, then it's going into cutting and sampling. I find this to be the most natural way of working, and this will be the case for all products cross category. Paintings and sculptures, everything has to start from the hand. I find it to be the quickest and most proficient way to think and to express. And here, just a fleeting still moment from the system of Cold Wall collaboration. Our most recent work with Gabriel Moses, who is a brilliant filmmaker, director, and photographer, who also hails from South London. And Gabriel is really special when it comes to contemporaries. I haven't necessarily found any until I met Gabriel and until I started working with Gabriel. He is an individual who's able to kind of capture all of the capillaries of what is said and what we discuss, but he's able to plot it into a single moment or into 100 moving frames, and the work does the speaking. And it's so rare to find a contemporary who just completely gets it. There isn't with Gabriel's work and with his level of skill and his perspective as an artist, there isn't a pandering to me, to be honest, some type of DEI quote of, okay, great, this is an artist from a demographic who I need to say I like because they have the same skin color as me. I don't have to do that with Gabriel. The work is absolutely incredible. And I will say that because others can't say it, but this is also an issue within the arts in terms of the level of work that we expect and how we critique work from particular demographics. With Gabriel, the work is so strong, so incredible. We can go back and forth for hours on concepts and ideas, and we've been working together for the past 3.5 years now, I believe, and within his own right, he is the future of fashion photography and cinematography and film as a whole. And again, these you can kind of see these images contrasting. This is a still from a film, again linked to Romero, that was shot in 2017, and we have a really exceptional team at Cold Wall, and we've worked with incredible talents, but we haven't been able to find anyone until working with Gabriel on the Cold Wall that's been able to capture this tension and energy until working with Gabriel, which is why I've kind of felt it quite important to mention him in the most recent, because of course he produced the most recent TN98 campaign, and it wasn't just the product, it was the iconography, it was the semantics and the visual literature which make it what it is. So these images are this is almost a bit of a back-to-back of Gabriel's images across this campaign and also mine, which is quite well. And then our last runway show, which we've moved away from runway, we focus now more on mono-store concession for a Cold War. And again, we're in year 8 of this entity now. And speaking honestly and quite crudely, I think when you do reach year 8 of running any type of entity, you need to have growth quotas in place. And we decided to move away from runway and we moved into fashion film instead. And a lot of the resources which would then go into runway went into opening global concessions across Asia Pacific for the brand. But our last runway film shot here is of course in turbine halls, within tanks, within Tate Modern. And this is a still from another long-term contemporary, Rob Rustling, who of course trained under Nick Knight for years, who was a dear friend who we've been working with for some time. And this is, from my perspective, the magnum opus of a Cold War's perspective in runway and in high fashion. It is this view which isn't tied to a particular race or demographic. It's much more about the thematics of what it is to be British in the now and how we inhibit Britain and what forms the inhibitions, whether it be architecture, whether it be European colour theory, whether it be movements and hairstyles which go back down to mod culture and whatnot. It's not one vernacular, it's an entire study on class, ideally through fashion, that we try to talk about. And then more images from Gabriel's most recent campaign. You can see there's this rhythm here of the extremity of the imagery is really important to ensuring that something is felt, something is pulled from the soul, and product is simply a host of that process to produce architecture, to produce sculpture. Product slots in on the back end of that. More studies here. These go back to some of the sketches that we showed prior as well, and again this idea of what does body armor of the now look like if it were to be reinterpreted? How do we still riff off these notions of protection, notions of exposure, which are often felt to those who would wear such attire? This idea of emerging from the unseen, the end of the Gilded Age with the bronze paint coming into play, a Sudanese model, which of course commenting on, throughout the runway shows we've always commented on the migrant crisis and the notion of people needing to be placed after being displaced, and of course the cause of the displaced. It's funny, isn't it, because you see the emergence of an East African body from the depths of a flat black emerging through Europe. He's pretty much captured this image within the halls of Tate and Lyle and the Tate family. All of these conversations about trade and imperial routes and the movement of bodies are all kind of integrated into the practice, but we'd often rather they be felt versus said. And this is just one slide which breaks into some of the work within SRA, but to not bore, because there are a lot of slides, we've just summarised it down to our most prized project and possession of SRA, which will be debuting shortly, which can't be photographed, but there is a still from the second tourbillon that we will be developing, and now the still's gone because that wasn't supposed to be shown. But has been shown. Yes, but they'll be happy to debut here, I'm sure. And then just a closing slide which kind of summarises the different materials within the process, from abstracted steel forms which have been welded and come together to have to form seating units for public forum as a public piece of art, down to fired OSB boards which hang on the left hand side in a piece called Others See It, down to candles burn, which is really about the continuous right and requirement for protesting being a liberty in this country, which we know has come under severe reform recently. All of these, moments of reality which a part of British life or part of the imperial flow of the British experience, all kind of integrated into the practice. And the favourite place of mine, one of the studios, one of 4 studios we have, which we titled The Hole, which is in Northamptonshire, and it's a series of 7 rooms split between different practices which primarily focus on paint. And that is the 90 slides of information.
Thank you, Samuel. I mean, you've touched on so many fascinating and important things there. I mean, I personally adore the Gabriel Moses Nike fashion photo shoot. It is incredible, and what you say about his work being so fundamental to your own, the way you sort of progress with your own work is also really fascinating. I'm not sure we have time for questions because we have to run off to dinner, but I mean, if anyone has anything burning that they'd like to ask.
One silver bullet, let's go.
We have to take it. Okay, wait.
Thank you so much for doing that. That was really incredible. Because your work is so kind of tied to materiality, I'd like to hear more a little bit about your thinking about the kind of readability of the cultural context and the conceptual context of these materials, especially something like milk and honey being kind of plastered onto the steel object, and how that looks like rust, but it's not really. It's got a deeper conceptual and cultural context. Just thinking about these ways of using material, like how do you think about that? How do you think about readability within that context?
Completely. I think there's 2 prospects there. One annex of that is there is this elation and freedom which comes from restraint and knowing on the topics you wish to contribute to. So if we're talking about imperial colonial spice trade routes, if we're talking about the relationship we have to Abrahamic religion within the West, it makes it easier to kind of pull the correct impetus and the correct minutiae from that canon. And if you then think about the second remit of restraint, which might be one's own lived experience, it might be the rudist architecture, it might be the movement through class systems, it might be working class culture, it might be the studies within graphics, the studies within industrial, which go into propagating materials and how materials respond. By combining those 2 channels of thought and bringing them together, it actually makes the selection process a little bit more simple and more direct into how you kind of form like an algebra and a visual literacy between the combining or combination of materials. And there's almost this other arm to it, which is almost this alchemaic process, right? This notion of how do you conjure newness from found material if you're working for the most part with restraint. Restraint might be the canons you wish to contribute to or comment on, or restraint in terms of actual material that you have to work with. And that then forms this new vocabulary where you're failing and fighting to find breakthroughs by combining what is applicable. And the alchemy part is there's 2 things, as you were saying, right? It looks like rust, but fundamentally it isn't. And then it's this commentary on our relationship to organic material and to organic matter, and the lack of it in a increased world of late capitalist goods, which are primarily plastics, TPEs, PPEs, PUs. There's a commentary there on that, but the actual deeper critique and writing pretty much goes into all of the literature. We've been working on our first kind of mono and LIFO, which will come about shortly in the next year and a half, potentially with Princeton Press, which will go into more detail behind some of the material studies and some of the thinking there. A portion of that is dissertation based, long form papers. Other elements are sonnets and haikus and pieces of poetry which are scribed down. There's this real asymmetric process which is almost baked into the way the studio works, and the prospect there is to not become a Luddite through the means of producing these artifacts. As soon as a way of thinking becomes too stiff, we have to break that and try and find new ground and try and find newness. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Samuel. We all agree that it's been an absolute joy to have Simon here. Thank you for coming. And we hope to see you more about this.